Hi, I'm Sarah.
And I'm Helen.
And this is the Squiggly Careers podcast. Every week we talk about a different topic to do with work and we share some ideas and some actions that we hope will help you to navigate your squiggly career with that bit more clarity and confidence. So today we're talking about the knowing-doing gap. And I think this is one where the minute you start diving into this, you realise there are so many things that we know we quote unquote should do, and actually we've got the knowledge about, but for some reason it doesn't quite translate into what we actually do. And so people talk quite a lot about the say-do gap, but I think that's a slightly different thing. That's sort of where you've almost perhaps being disingenuous. You say one thing, but then you don't actually follow through on it. I do think perhaps that is slightly worse. But the knowing-doing gap, it's sort of like you've got the knowledge, you've got the know-how. I think actually practically, like almost like rationally and objectively, you know this thing makes sense, but for some reason it just doesn't show up. It's not what you do, and actually it can be quite hard to figure out, like, well, why not? And then, like, how do I do something about this? Because these can be quite a big source of frustrations, I think.
And before I share my perspective on this, I need to just apologise.
With a cold.
I've got a cold, a bit nasally. We're just going to have to go with it because the podcast doesn't stop even when you have a cold. But we thought we'd try and share some sort of common knowing-doing gaps that we have seen with people that we work with. And we thought we'd share some of ours as well. So some that you might relate to are when you know how to prioritise your work, like you got all the theory, but you still never feel like you're particularly in control of it. Or maybe you know that you should take breaks in your day, but you keep compromising your boundaries. So you never have a lunch break, for example, you never finish on time. Or maybe you know that you should take time to learn, that's important, but it's always the last thing on your to-do list. And I think what tends to happen is sometimes we think, well, I'll just find another tool or another model. There must be another thing that I could find out about that would help me to do this better. But the issue is not getting more knowledge. The issue is actually kind of the action happening. It's the gap that just gets bigger the more you invest in the knowing rather than the doing.
And I do wonder if there is a relationship between almost like how long you've known the thing but not been able to do the thing, maybe the harder it gets. Because over time it just builds up and you sort of, you need to do this thing, but you just haven't kind of found a way through it. It might also just be worth reflecting on when you're thinking about your knowing-doing gaps and when we talk about examples and the actions that we're going to go on to. Is this something where you've had this no-do gap for a long time? Sort of it's been kicking around almost since you started your career or, over quite a few years. Or does this feel like a relatively new no-do gap? Because that also might... You'll then get a bit of a sense, I think, for sort of how deep-seated this is, almost like how lodged in your brain it is. And that'll also give you a sense of how hard it might be and to kind of encourage you to take the right actions when we get to that section.
I guess it takes you a bit to fixed and growth mindset, doesn't it? Because you might start saying, well, I just can't do this. I'm not a person who's able to close this gap. That's just not the kind of thing that I'm good at. Whereas if you've got growth mindset, you'd sort of see the gap and know that there was something that you could do to close it. And you'd believe that you just hadn't taken that action yet, but that you could.
So should we talk about a few of ours? A few of our knowing, doing gaps. Initially, I'm not sure it's a super easy question to answer when we were both reflecting on this. But something that sort of unlocked the list, because then actually when you get started, you're like, the floodgates have opened, was Helen mentioned that often these kind of knowing-doing gaps are a source of kind of recurring frustration or very familiar frustration. And I think that's because you've got the knowing, but you don't then do anything with it. That sort of feels annoying. Like I get annoyed at myself and I sort of question myself, like, well, why don't I do this? Like, I know this is a good thing to do. I know this is the right thing to do. And so maybe if you're thinking, I'm not sure what mine are, instead come at it from the kind of point of frustration or getting annoyed at yourself, then that opened up lots of things for me. So Helen, which one did you get to as your sort of priority one? Because we're going to use these as examples as we go through today.
I know, because I've read an awful lot about it, and you've told me quite a lot about it, that multitasking is bad. Like, I know that you end up with task switching and you're less effective on all the different activities that you try and do, but I still do it. I have a real gap between knowing that it's not good for my work, but still kind of habitually multitasking in my days.
And I know that asking and giving feedback is really important. We've talked about it on the podcast before. I've read and watched and listened to lots about it. And I do it very infrequently and in a very ad hoc way. And I certainly don't do it sort of frequently and fearlessly in the way that I want to. and then definitely sort of get mad at myself because of it. That was just the start of the list, but we're just going to stick with one example for today.
And I guess you probably got to find a little bit of motivation, which we're going to get into in some of our ideas for action, between keeping the gap and closing the gap. Because to Sarah's point, if you've been sat with this for a while, you might think, well, why do I need to change now? But just some kind of high level reasons about why you might want to close the gap. A, it's not great to work with frustration every day. And just to build on the point that Sarah talked about there, in the research, they call it cognitive dissonance. So this is where, like Sarah might say, oh, I'm a leader who values feedback. This should be part of the way I work. And then when you're not doing that, it's almost, they kind of say it's like an identity undermining experience. Like I'm not behaving in a way that someone that I believe myself to be should do. So closing the gap gets rid of that dissonance, which is not really great for our motivation at work. Also, you stop improving, because if you're just keeping doing something that ultimately isn't working for you, then you might kind of get stuck or stagnate with your development. So that's obviously a bit of an issue if we don't close the gap. And I think this might sound a bit harsh, but I think other people might lose confidence in your ability to act. So for example, if Sarah keeps saying to me, Helen, I just need you to focus on this project, and I'm like, no, I will, but I never do, then over time, Sarah's just going to stop asking me to focus on a project because she's not going to have any confidence that I'm actually going to be able to commit to the work. So I think some of this is about you, and some of it's probably about other people's experience of working with you.
And we were also reflecting on, you probably have some knowing doing gaps that are very personal to you. They're sort of really specific to you and your skills and your strengths and what you're not doing but want to do for your own personal development. But we also think that there are probably some team knowing doing gaps. So as a team, we know we want to do this, but for some reason it's not actually happening. So maybe there are some team things. And then there are often organisation ones as well. And actually some of the research, one of the HBR articles, which Helen found, which is actually over 20 years old, talks about this idea of organisations sort of knowing too much and doing too little. And they sort of describe this as the knowing doing gap. So I think there's sort of 3 different lenses here that you can look at this from: the organisation lens, the sort of team lens, and then for like you personally, which is sort of where we're going to start, because we know that's where we have the most control to do something different.
So we've got 5 different ideas for action to help you close the knowing doing gap. And I don't think you have to do all of these. There's a couple of different models. So I think it might be worth you thinking which is the most effective one for me to start with, so that you can make a bit of progress. But we will go through them in turn, and Sarah and I are going to use our gaps to kind of illustrate what they might look like. So Sarah, maybe if I talk about the first one, and then we take your gap around feedback to bring it to life for people a little bit.
Great.
Can't wait. She's ready. So the first idea for action comes from someone called BJ Fogg, which I just think is quite a cool name, and who has a very popular model called the Fogg Behaviour Change Model. And the reason we think this is relevant is because closing the gap will probably require a change in your behaviour, because if it was that easy, you would have done it already. So there is something that we need to sort of trigger within you that is going to change your behaviour and result in you kind of doing something different and closing this gap. And what BJ Fogg says in the behaviour change model is that there are 3 elements that have to come together in order for a change in behaviour to occur. So basically, in order for you to want to close this gap. So the first is motivation. What's the desire to do? The second is ability. How easy is it for you? And the third is a prompt. What's going to make you do it now? And so when we get these 3 elements, motivation, ability, and a prompt, when they come together, then we've sort of got the ingredients for a change in behaviour, for this sort of, I guess it's the desire to do the do. That's what we're trying to get to. So Sarah, if we were going to take your feedback bit and the motivation, what's your desire to change the way that you're approaching feedback at the moment?
So I actually find this model really helpful, because what I've realised is 2 of these 3 things I have, but one of them is missing. And that's the reason that I've got the gap. So motivation, one of my values is achievement. And I know that I'll be better if I get more feedback from people. And also I want to support other people to be even better and explore their potential. So I actually have really high motivation personally, because there's a really good fit with my values. And also we do talk about feedback in our workshops, and so the more that I live and breathe this, the more examples I've got, the more useful I can be, and useful is one of our company values. So my motivation actually feels really high. In terms of ability, I'm going to say that I would back myself, because I go, well, I actually,
I'm good.
I do know, this is a problem, isn't it? Because this is why you've got the no-do gap. I know how to frame feedback. I've got some good tools. I know what good looks like. And I feel like I could do a decent job of this. So I'm sort of not scared, I suppose, of my capability or worried about my capability. I've realised my problem is the prompt. So I don't have any kind of trigger or sort of natural situation where I sort of go, oh, okay, this is the moment where I ask for some feedback from people that I work with in Amazing If, the clients that I work with, from you, for example. And I also don't have the kind of other trigger to sort of go, oh, and then this is when I kind of give that feedback, or this is the moment where I make that happen. This is the sort of the time in my diary where this becomes a reality. And so even just by very quickly looking at sort of that triangle of three things, I'm like, oh, okay, so 1 and 2 is fine. But because I don't have that prompt, I just don't ever do it. So that's my problem. So I think what that has naturally helped me to do is a bit of red, amber, green on motivation, ability and prompt. And essentially I've kind of spotted that I've got a red on prompt. And then it makes you think about, well, okay, I've got the awareness. I think what this gets you to quite quickly is awareness, but it perhaps doesn't quite get you to action. But it at least gets you to thinking about, well, what does that action need to be? What don't I do that I need to start doing? And I think some of the other things that we're going to talk about now might help to sort of fill that gap. So I wonder if that first bit is just like well, where am I? If all of those three are red, you're like, okay, well, this is why it's so hard. What about if you were doing it, Helen, for multitasking?
What's my drive to do? To progress some high priority projects.
Okay.
Well, my ability, I struggle with I struggle with ability. I think ability and prompt. I don't think I necessarily have a trigger. Like the motivation, I'm really clear about. I really care about some of the high profile projects, but I think I would need to make it easier to not multitask. You know, maybe I do. So for example, doing that work in a different place, because it's kind of hard for me sometimes if I'm trying to do a big project that needs a lot of concentration, but I'm doing it at my desk where all the other things that I need to do are around me. I find it really hard to do that. So I would need to make it easy, probably by having like a dedicated day or going to a different place. So it creates that environment for me. That would make it easier. And then the trigger, I don't know what the trigger would be. It's probably you holding me to account or something. Like
probably just you.
probably a whip from you. Less of a trigger, more of a whip. But I was thinking, though, as you were talking, that as well as this being quite a good thing for self-reflection, I think it's also quite a good way that you could support somebody. You know, if you noticed somebody wasn't making progress on something, they had a bit of a gap and they keep going, oh, I want to move this forward, but it's just not happening, or I want to work in this way, but I've just not been able to do it, that kind of a thing. I think prompting someone, say, well, what's your motivation? What's getting in your way? How could you make it easier? And what's going to be a trigger that would help you to do it? Just those three simple questions, I think, could help someone. They don't need to know that it's a FOG behaviour change model. It's just a couple of little coaching questions you're asking somebody, but I think that could be quite helpful. So the second idea for action is a bit of borrowed brilliance from Gretchen Rubin, whose website I had a great time on. She's got a lovely kind of little happiness AI thing, and you can ask it questions. It's good. Loads of free resources, so I'd recommend having a look at her website. But one of the quizzes on her website is about understanding your tendency. And your tendency affects how likely you are to kind of stick to things and commit to doing things. And she identifies 4 different tendencies. So, for example, there's the upholder tendency. These are people that respond readily to outer and inner expectations. So, you know, if Sarah expects me to do it, then I'm going to get it, do it. I will uphold what I say I'm going to do. There's the questioner tendency that will only commit to something if they are convinced. So if Sarah asks me to do something, I need to ask her a few questions to see whether I buy into doing it. There's the obliger, who is like, well, if you do it, then I'll do it. So it's almost like there's an expectation that they're trying to meet, an outer expectation. So it's less about my inner motivation. It's more, I don't want to let Sarah down. And then there's the rebel, and they are just counter, basically. So they'll only do it if they've decided to do it. So if Sarah says to me, oh, Helen, I think you should stop multitasking, I'd be like, yeah, great idea, Sarah. I'm not going to do it. The point here is, if you understand your tendency, you can kind of design your doing around it. So you're more likely to stick at it. And so there is actually the quiz, and it will tell you what your tendency is. So I came out as a rebel, for example, which means I will only decide to do something if it is my decision to do it. So the multitasking thing, for example, there's not much point Sarah saying to me, oh, I think you should kind of just focus on one thing this week and get it done.
I know. I've tried that.
She tried it.
I tried and it does not make any difference.
I need to sort of design my week in a way that's going to work for me. And then once I've done that, I'm probably going to be more committed to taking that action. And so the point here really is maybe take the test. It's super quick. It's like a couple of minutes. It's got some really interesting insights, but understand how your tendency could help you to design the doing so that you're more likely to commit to it. So for example, if you come out as an obliger, maybe I could make a commitment to Sarah and say, oh, I'm going to do this for you by the end of the week. And I'd be more likely to do it because I've got that tendency of sort of, obligation, which could increase my kind of stickability at this thing.
And I think we will move swiftly past the fact that we are both rebels and what that might mean for how difficult we both are to work with. Of all of them, it's like, well, you can't make me, and I basically can't make myself, and I really just have to decide for myself. So I was like, oh, fun. We sound fun, don't we? So our third action is how you move from those gaps to what we're calling having a go. So really practically, what does this look like? And we've sort of got 4 questions, and I thought I would talk through mine around feedback to then hopefully by the time you've gone through these 4 questions, you are getting to having a go. So you are moving from essentially doing nothing to doing something, which it does feel, like you say, it does feel a bit harsh, but that is our reality. So question 1, what's my gap? So I would say asking and giving feedback as frequently as I would like. Question 2, what's my goal? Frequent and fearless feedback. So I'm really clear about like what I want that outcome to be. Question 3, what's getting in the way? Time, spotting the situation, which I now know that's getting in my way because I've sort of done that sort of analysis of sort of the motivation and the moments and the prompts. So both time, spotting the situation, and probably sometimes worrying about people's responsives, maybe if it's more hard to hear feedback. So there's probably a bit of that along the way, but not just that. And then 4, the bit that really matters, what's one small thing I could have a go at? And then this is where you are starting small, keeping it simple and being really specific. So when I went through this process, I was really trying to challenge myself to go, what feels realistic? What feels relevant? What have I got really high levels of control over? So I thought, oh, okay, well, I could start each week by asking someone from our Amazing If team for some feedback. So first thing I do in a week, I'd probably, if I was going to be even more specific, I could say start each week by asking someone for feedback over Teams, just using one feedback question. Like I would know those questions, like I said, I would have the capability to know what to ask, and it could be about my strengths, it could be about my impact, it could be an even better if question. But maybe just by getting into that routine of starting my week by asking for some feedback, I've done something, so I'm further forward than I was at the start, the previous week, and also it probably raises feedback up in my mind in terms of it's important, it makes it a priority. You sort of create a bias towards, okay, well, I am trying to close this gap. This is one action that's going to help me to do that. I would probably have to put a reminder in my diary to make that happen. Otherwise, I'd forget, especially on a Monday morning. But that feels like something I've got high levels of confidence about my ability to actually do that. And I think that's a good stress test to have at the end of asking yourself those questions. Just do that stress test as if you were sort of coaching yourself. Out of 10, how confident do I feel about taking that action? And here I think we are looking for like a 9 or 10 out of 10. And if any lower than that, can you make the action smaller? Could it be even more straightforward? Because if it's anything below that, then you're just going to go back to having the gap again.
I was trying to think about this for mine. So what's my gap? My gap is being able to focus on one thing at once. What's my goal? To make progress on some high priority projects. What's getting in the way? Trying to do too many things in a day. What's one small thing I could have a go at? Block out one morning a week for high priority projects. I think actually, because when you feel the frustration, we talked around like, what does this gap feel like? You're kind of living with the gap quite a lot and it feels frustrating. And sometimes you just need a framework to think it through. And you kind of go, oh, of course, that's what I need. But when you're really frustrated, of course, you just need to make feedback the first thing you do in a day. Like, of course you do. But when you're really frustrated, I think it's really hard sometimes to see what you need to do differently. And so it might just seem like 4 very simple questions, but they are sort of designed to go from something that feels difficult and frustrating and that you've probably been sitting with for quite a while to something that is simple and doable today, ideally, like something you can act on straight away.
Well, I guess that's also part of having this knowing doing gap is you probably know quite a lot. And that might make it hard to know where to start because you're like, well, I could do this and I could do that. Almost like I don't think people will find it hard to know what they could do, but almost like the problem is then we don't do any of those things. So actually by just going, it's one small thing that you can just sort of start straight away. Actually, we're being quite sort of reductionist, aren't we? We're sort of going and being quite empathetic on ourselves to sort of go, this is not an easy gap to close. So to having a go, I think feels like a good sort of mindset to have in mind. Next action is about getting a doing mentor. So this is someone who does the thing that you want to do. So they are already doing it. You can sort of see that they are making that thing happen. And this is not just about having a sort of nice chat or just sort of, catching up with the person. Essentially what you are trying to do is unlock what it is that they have managed to do, their techniques, like tried and tested tools, like how do they take action so that then you can figure out, could any of that be useful for me? So essentially, I think here you are looking for someone who doesn't have that knowing doing gap. They're going, there is no gap. They've either closed the gap or they just didn't have it in the first place. So then you're sort of going, right, well, what is it about their approach that I could sort of make my approach?
So we've tried to create a bit of a script to get you started with how you could get some support from someone who does the thing that you might not do very well at the moment. So Sarah's going to be my example for this because she is very good at focusing on work and I often get easily distracted. So this is how I would frame it using the script. So I admire your ability to focus on one thing at once. I know that matters, but I struggle to press pause on other people's priorities when I'm trying to work on one thing. How would you approach that challenge? And so just before Sarah comes in, the 3 kind of points there are, I admire your ability to, I know it matters, but I struggle to, and how would you approach that challenge? So you're sort of acknowledging that they've got this ability. You're also being a bit vulnerable that you find it difficult, but you're then asking them for help with their expertise. So that's what those kind of 3 different questions are going to get at. So Sarah, my struggle is sort of pressing pause on other people when I'm trying to do a bit of deep work. So if that was you, how would you approach that challenge?
So I think the first thing I would say to you is, you should recognise that struggle comes from a really good place of wanting to be supportive, wanting to be helpful and responsive. And those are all kind of really, really good skills. I would also probably say to you, oh, that's interesting. I thought maybe you'd be struggling with distractions that come from tech or notifications. So that's why it's really important, I think, that you're sharing your struggle with me rather than me second guessing or assuming why you find it hard to focus on one thing at once. Because otherwise the advice or the suggestions that I would give you might not help to address your struggle. So I'm going, okay, well, that's interesting. So it's not tech that's your sort of distraction downfall. It's actually sort of other people, pressing pause on other people. And if we were genuinely having this conversation, I think I'd say, okay, well, that's not directly a challenge for me. I think I find that okay. I find it okay to basically, I suppose what we're saying is like leave people waiting or not getting back to people immediately. And then very practically, I think I'd probably say to you, well, look, given that is sort of part of your DNA, and this is going to feel quite different to what you do at the moment, maybe what you could do is block out some time for your focused work that you really want to do, but know that straight after that, you've got in your diary what I would kind of label as a responsiveness hour. So essentially, that sort of almost kind of the payoff from not multitasking, focusing on one thing at once is then straight after that, you're going to get the chance to go back to people, respond to things quickly. You know it's coming, and also you know it's coming really soon. So it's not like I'm saying to you, you've got to wait 2 days for that. Essentially, I'm asking you to press pause on other people for just these 2 hours, but also knowing that straight after those 2 hours, you've then got the chance to kind of make sure everyone's got what they need. And then I'd probably ask you, well, how realistic does that feel for you in your week?
So my reflections on what Sarah has shared is I quite like the idea of having like a rapid response hour. That really appeals to me.
Oh yeah, that sounds exactly like you. I actually don't know why you don't already do that, because that is definitely you are like rapid response person.
Well, the problem is I do it all day, but I think actually doing it now is probably more effective. But also, just when I was asking Sarah those sort of questions, it made me think that it's a much easier way of asking for help. So if I just said to Sarah, I'm really struggling with like deep work, can you help me? That's quite hard for me to say, and it's maybe a little bit vague. Whereas using that script, like I admire, I struggle too, how would you approach that challenge? It sort of gives you an easier way to ask for the help. We'll put all those statements in the pod sheet so that you can see those really easily. But just say, I found that a lot easier than just saying, I'm struggling, can you help me? It's an easier way into that conversation, I think.
I also think it makes sure that you get the help that is useful for you, because we tested these ideas. That may or may not be believable listening to the podcast, but we tested all these ideas beforehand. And interestingly, the first time we tested it, I ended up trying to help Helen with I was like, oh, maybe it's all of Helen's notifications and all of her tech that's the problem. But then when Helen really thought about it, she was like, that's actually not the issue. So I could have easily helped Helen with the wrong thing if she hadn't signaled to me what was the thing that she was struggling with. And then actually as a result, you get to a much, much better place. So I can be more useful in terms of the help that I'm giving. And then Helen gets something that's much more helpful in terms of what she practically can then go away and do. And then our last action is to have a doing dress rehearsal. So I think these knowing doing gaps are hard to close. And I just like the idea of picking, maybe you pick a day, maybe you pick a week. I think it depends what your gap is. And you just sort of think, oh, I'm just going to try it out just for this day, just for this hour, just for this week. And you're not too attached to the outcome. And we've not talked about it loads today, but here, when you're doing something new or that you've not done for a long time, the likelihood is you're not going to be that good at it. And so one of the stumbling blocks here could be that you try something. Like, let's say I was like, oh, I asked for feedback on a Monday from someone. This wouldn't happen in Amazing If, but let's say in somewhere else that I've worked. And let's say you don't get anything in return. That person doesn't give you the feedback. And so it knocks your confidence quite quickly. And then you revert straight back to that knowing doing gap. So, you try to do something about it, but perhaps it didn't go that well. Or let's say Helen tried to do that focus time with the rapid response, but the first time she did the focus time, maybe she got 2 hours. And actually she was like, oh, I only lasted an hour. I feel like I failed. I feel like I couldn't even do that. And then, we get into sort of quite an unhelpful cycle of, I'm just not good at that, back to kind of fixed mindset. Whereas I think if you have this idea of a dress rehearsal, we just know, this idea of dress rehearsal is like a practice. It's a practice where things will go wrong. We make adjustments after a dress rehearsal before the sort of main performance, and you sort of adjust accordingly. And so let's say Helen did try to do that 2 hours and she figured out, actually, do you know what? Initially, that's too long. I'm now going to try an hour. I'm going to try 45 minutes. But we don't feel like we failed. And so I think just this idea of, if you just picked a moment to be like, oh, I'm having a bit of a doing dress rehearsal, I think you give yourself a lot of permission to practice, to have a play, to lower your expectations of yourself, which I think all those things are quite helpful here, because we are doing something that is hard and probably something you've not done that recently.
So just to summarise the different things that we've covered, and as I said, these will go in the pod sheet, which you can download and kind of work it all through. We started with a bit of self-awareness. So we've got that behaviour change model, and then also understanding your tendency. So that's sort of, I think, how you can sort of design the doing so it works for you, understanding your motivation and your ability. The second thing we started talking about was much more around action. So we've got gaps and giving it a go, getting a doing mentor, doing a dress rehearsal. So all the questions and the prompts that we put together, we'll put in the pod sheet. You can get that on the show notes on Apple, or if you just go to amazingif.com and you go to the podcast page, you'll be able to see all the episodes there and you can download it. And if you want to dive in a bit deeper, you can also join us at Pod Plus. That happens every Thursday morning at 9 o'clock, and it is a free 30-minute session where we can do some doing design together to help you take action.
But that's everything for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll be back with you again soon. Bye for now.
Bye, everyone.